The screaming started before dawn, voices sharp with hatred cutting through the mountain cold like rifle fire. And by the time Clay Bridger emerged from his cabin with his Winchester loaded, the mob had already reached the creek where two small figures huddled beneath a cottonwood tree, their dark skin and foreign clothes marking them as different in a territory that had learned to fear difference more than death itself. Clay Bridger had chosen the high country specifically because it asked nothing of him. The Colorado Rockies in 1887 were unforgiving but honest, and a man could lose himself among the peaks without answering questions about what he'd seen during the war or why his hands still shook when thunder rolled across the valleys. He'd built his cabin at 9,000 feet, where the air was thin and the silence thick, where he could trap beaver and hunt elk without seeing another soul for months at a time, where the ghosts of Shiloh and Antietam couldn't find him among the granite and pine. But the screaming shattered that silence like glass. He'd ridden down to Redemption Springs the day before for supplies, his quarterly trip to the ramshackle mining town that clung to existence through sheer stubbornness and the fading hope of silver strikes. The town had grown meaner since his last visit, desperation etched into every weathered face as the mines played out and winter approached with the inevitability of judgment. Men stood in tight clusters outside the saloon, speaking in the low tones that preceded violence, and Clay had felt the familiar tightening in his gut that warned him trouble was brewing. He'd loaded his supplies quickly, paid the storekeeper in coin without conversation, and was preparing to leave when he'd heard the commotion near the preacher's house. A crowd had gathered, their voices rising in that particular pitch that preceded either a hanging or a burning. Clay had seen both during the war and had no stomach for either anymore. But something made him pause, made him listen. The crowd murmured agreement, fear and superstition weaving together into something uglier than either alone. Clay saw hands moving toward rope, saw the way men shifted their weight forward like wolves preparing to strike, and he saw the girls understanding what was coming. He saw the older one whisper something to the younger, saw them both accept their death with the terrible resignation of those who had already learned the world was cruel. "The missionary who brought them is dead too," someone shouted from the crowd. "Harper died screaming of the fever just yesterday. His last words were that he'd made a mistake bringing them here, that they carried curse in their very blood." Clay had known missionaries, had known their particular brand of zealous foolishness, had known how they collected orphans like some men collected scalps, proof of their righteousness and dedication. Harper had been a fixture in the territory for years, always dragging some new convert or rescued soul back from his travels, but this time he'd brought something the town couldn't forgive. He'd brought visible difference into a place that survived by sameness, by knowing who belonged and who didn't, and he'd died before he could protect them. The preacher raised his Bible like a shield. The good book speaks of purging evil from among us, of protecting the flock from contamination. These children of darkness must be driven out, cast into the wilderness where they can harm no one. Let the mountains take them, let the cold and the wolves be their judgment, for we will not harbor plague in Redemption Springs. Clay had turned his horse then, had ridden away before he could do something foolish, but the image of those two girls stayed with him, branded into his mind like a hot iron. He'd seen children killed before, had seen it in the war when Sherman's march left nothing living in its wake, had seen it on the frontier when cavalry cleared villages, had seen it enough times that he'd promised himself never again. Never to stand by while the innocent was sacrificed to the cruelty of frightened men. But he was one man, and the crowd had been 30 strong, and some promises were easier made than kept. He'd ridden back to his cabin telling himself it wasn't his concern, telling himself he'd earned his isolation, that he owed nothing to anyone, that those girls were doomed regardless, and his interference would only add his corpse to theirs. But he hadn't slept, had spent the night staring at his cabin ceiling while the wind howled outside, and memories he'd tried to bury clawed their way back to the surface. Then came the dawn and the screaming. Clay grabbed his rifle and ammunition belt. shoved his feet into his boots and ran toward the sound. His cabin sat 2 miles above the town, positioned where the creek tumbled down from the high country, and the screaming was coming from just below his property line. From the cottonwood grove where the creek widened into a pool, he crashed through the underbrush and found them. The mob had driven the girls out of town during the night, had chased them up the mountain road with torches and stones, had hunted them like animals until the children had collapsed here by the creek, too exhausted to run further, too terrified to fight back. The older girl had positioned herself in front of the younger one, her small body an inadequate shield against the half-dozen men who stood around them with ropes and rifles. The same preacher from yesterday stood at the front of the group, his face flushed with righteous fury. You see how they flee toward darkness, how they seek the high places where demons dwell. Even in their flight, they reveal their true nature. Clay stepped into the clearing, his Winchester held easy but ready, his voice cutting through the morning air like a blade. "That's far enough." The men turned, surprise and then anger flashing across their faces. The preacher's eyes narrowed. "Bridger, this doesn't concern you. These creatures are town business. They carry plague and must be purged." "They're children," Clay said flatly, his finger resting on the trigger guard. "And you're on my land now, which makes them my business." One of the men, a burly miner named Coltrane that Clay recognized from the general store, spat into the dirt. "You defending heathens now, Bridger? We heard you were a good Union man during the war, but maybe we heard wrong. Maybe you got sympathies for the wrong kind of people." Clay let the insults slide past him. He'd been called worse by better men. "I got sympathy for not murdering children because you're scared of bad luck. You want to blame someone for your troubles. Blame the mine owners who dig without shoring. Blame yourselves for building a town in a place that can't sustain it. But these girls didn't cause your fever or your cave-ins. They're just convenient. They're plague," the preacher insisted, his voice rising. 3 weeks of nothing but death and misfortune. You cannot deny the pattern. You cannot ignore God's judgment. "I can ignore your judgment," Clay said, and levered a round into the Winchester's chamber. The sound was sharp and final in the mountain air. The men shifted nervously, suddenly aware that the situation had changed, that the lone mountain man with the rifle might be more dangerous than 2 exhausted children. Coltrane's hand moved toward his pistol. "You threatening us, Bridger?" "I'm stating fact," Clay replied, his voice calm as winter ice. "You're on my property. You're threatening children under my protection, and if any of you makes a move toward those girls, I will shoot you dead and sleep fine tonight. Now you've got about 10 seconds to start walking back down that mountain before I decide you're trespassing with hostile intent." The preacher's face went purple. "You would protect plague? You would harbor evil?" "Ugh, I've seen evil," Clay said quietly, and something in his tone made the men step back, made them see whatever lived behind his eyes that he usually kept hidden. "I've seen what men do when they convince themselves their cruelty is righteous. I've seen towns burned and children killed and good people turned into monsters because they were scared. And I'm telling you now that if you take one more step toward those girls, you'll meet the part of me that came back from the war. And none of you want that." The standoff stretched, tension tight as a rope about to snap. Then Coltrane muttered something under his breath and turned away. The others followed, the preacher last of all, his parting words carried venom. "You'll regret this, Bridger. Plague spreads, and when it reaches you, when death comes to your door, you'll wish you'd let us do what needed doing." Clay watched them disappear down the trail, waited until the sound of their footsteps faded, then finally turned toward the girls. They hadn't moved, still frozen beneath the cottonwood tree. The older girl's arms still wrapped around the younger one, both of them staring at him with eyes that expected nothing good, expected only a different kind of violence. Clay felt something crack in his chest at that look, at the absolute absence of hope he saw there. He lowered his rifle, held his hands away from his body in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "You speak English?" The older girl's voice was barely a whisper, accented but clear. "Yes, sir. What are your names?" She hesitated, as if even that information might be used against her, then spoke. I am Priya. This is my sister Meera. We are from Bengal. The missionary Harper brought us here when our parents died of cholera. He said America would be better. He said we would be safe." Her voice broke on the last word, and Clay felt anger burn hot in his gut. Anger at Harper for his foolish optimism. Anger at the town for their fear. Anger at a world that could look at two orphan children and see plague instead of tragedy. "The preacher said you brought death," Clay said, and saw both girls flinch. "Said everyone who came near you died or suffered. Is that true?" Priya's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "Everywhere we go, people die. It has been this way since our parents passed. The other children on the ship died. The families who took us in India died. Missionary Harper died. Everyone says we are cursed. Everyone says we carry plague. Maybe they are right. Maybe we are evil." "You're not evil," Clay said, surprised by the conviction in his own voice. "You're unlucky, and there's a difference." "What difference?" Meera spoke for the first time, her voice so small it barely carried. "Dead is dead. Curse or chance makes no change to those in the ground." Clay had no answer to that. The girl was right in her terrible child's logic. So instead he asked a different question. "Where were you planning to go when you ran from town?" Priya straightened slightly, some stubborn pride surfacing through the fear. "We were going to walk until we found another town, another place that might take us, or until we couldn't walk anymore. It makes no difference. Either way, everyone calls us plague. And what if I called you something different?" Clay heard himself say, heard the words come out before he'd consciously decided to speak them, heard his isolation and his peace and his carefully constructed solitude crumbling with each syllable. "What if I called you blessed?" Both girls stared at him as if he'd spoken in tongues. Priya's mouth opened and closed, searching for words. Finally she managed, "Why would you say such a thing?" Clay looked at them, really looked at them. He saw the exhaustion and terror and desperate hope they were trying so hard to hide. He saw himself 15 years ago, stumbling away from the war with the same look in his eyes. He saw in them a chance at something he'd thought lost forever. Redemption maybe, or purpose, or just the simple act of being needed, because everyone needs someone to call them blessed, he said. "And I figure I'm as good a candidate as any to be that someone. Now you can come with me to my cabin, or you can keep running, but I'm offering shelter and food and protection for as long as you need it. No strings, no expectations, just a roof and a chance to rest." Priya looked at Meera, some silent communication passing between the sisters. Then back at Clay, her voice was steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "Why would you help us? You don't know us. We might truly be cursed. We might bring you only death and suffering." "Might," Clay agreed. "Or might not. But I'd rather take that risk than spend the rest of my life wondering what kind of man I'd become if I walked away. So what do you say? You willing to take a chance on a broken-down mountain man with more ghosts than sense?" For the first time since he'd seen them, something other than fear appeared in Priya's eyes. Something fragile and tentative but real. Hope. She nodded slowly, helped Meera to her feet, and the three of them stood in the mountain mourning as the sun finally crested the peaks. Clay Bridger, who had spent 15 years running from connection, found himself suddenly and irrevocably responsible for two orphaned girls who everyone else had condemned. He'd regret it, the preacher had said. Plague spreads, but as he led Priya and Meera up the trail toward his cabin, as he felt their small hands occasionally brush against his coat, as if to reassure themselves he was real, as he heard Meera whisper to her sister in their native tongue, and heard the word that needed no translation, Hope Clay thought that maybe regret came in different forms. Maybe the worst regret wasn't what you did, but what you failed to do, and he'd failed too many people already. He wouldn't fail these two. The walk to the cabin took 20 minutes, the trail steep and rocky, winding through stands of ponderosa pine and aspen that shimmered gold in the morning light. Priya and Meera struggled with the altitude, their breath coming in harsh gasps, their legs shaking from exhaustion and fear and the simple fact that they'd been running for their lives all night. Clay slowed his pace, paused frequently under the pretense of checking the trail, gave them time to recover without making them feel weak. When they finally reached the clearing where his cabin stood, both girls stopped and stared. It wasn't much, just a single-room structure built from hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney rising from one end. A small porch faced east toward the valley, and behind the cabin stood a lean-to shelter for his horse and a root cellar dug into the hillside. Simple, sturdy, isolated. Everything Clay had wanted when he'd fled civilization 15 years ago. "It's not fancy," he said, suddenly aware of how rough it must look to children who'd come from a world of missionaries and towns and proper houses. "But it's warm and dry, and there's room enough for 3 if we don't mind being close." Priya's voice was soft, almost reverent. "It's beautiful." Clay looked at her sharply, expecting mockery or pity, but saw only sincerity in her dark eyes. She was looking at the cabin, the way a drowning person looked at shore, the way he'd looked at it himself when he'd first arrived here, broken and bleeding from wounds that had nothing to do with bullets. "Come on," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the emotion in her voice. "Let's get you inside and fed. You look half-starved." The cabin's interior was as simple as its exterior. One large room dominated by a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a bed in the corner covered with wool blankets and furs, shelves lined with supplies and books and the accumulated debris of a solitary life. It smelled of wood smoke and coffee and the lingering scent of the venison he'd cooked 2 days ago. Morning light slanted through the 2 small windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Priya and Mira stood just inside the doorway, uncertain, as if waiting for permission to exist in this space. Clay gestured toward the table. "Sit, I'll make something to eat." He moved to the fireplace, stirred the coals to life, added kindling and then larger pieces of wood until flames crackled and popped. He filled his battered coffee pot with water from the bucket by the door, measured out grounds with practiced ease, set it to heat. Then he pulled out supplies, hard bread and dried meat, and a precious jar of preserves he'd been saving. Laid them on the table before the girls. They didn't move, just stared at the food as if it might vanish if they blinked. "Eat," Clay said, his voice gentler than he'd intended. "You're safe here. Nobody's going to take it away." Priya reached out slowly, her hand trembling as she tore a piece of bread and handed it to Mira before taking any for herself. The gesture, so automatic and protective, reminded Clay of soldiers he'd known during the war, the ones who'd given their rations to wounded comrades even when they were starving themselves. The ones who'd survived, not because they were strongest, but because they'd had someone to protect. The girls ate slowly, carefully, as if their stomachs had forgotten how to process food. Clay poured coffee for himself and water for them, added a spoonful of the preserves to their cups to give them something sweet. He watched them drink, saw color begin to return to their faces, saw the desperate edge of fear start to soften. When they'd finished, Mira spoke, her voice stronger now. "The preacher said we killed missionary Harper, did we?" Clay set down his cup, chose his words carefully. "Harper died of fever. Same fever that's been running through mining camps all over the territory this summer. It's got nothing to do with you and everything to do with bad water and close quarters and men too stubborn to see a doctor until it's too late." "But the others," Priya pressed. "The baby, the old man, the cave-ins. How do you explain all of that?" "I don't," Clay said bluntly. "Life is random and cruel, and sometimes terrible things happen in clusters for no reason at all. You could just as easily argue that the town was cursed before you arrived, and you're the cure instead of the cause. But people don't think that way. They see patterns where there's only chaos, because chaos is scarier than having someone to blame." "So we're not plague?" Mira's voice was so hopeful it hurt to hear. Clay met her eyes, held her gaze with the same steady certainty he'd used with frightened soldiers. "You're not plague. You're 2 girls who've had more than your share of bad luck and landed in a town full of frightened, ignorant people. That's all. The rest is just stories they tell themselves to make sense of a world that doesn't make sense." Priya's shoulders began to shake, and suddenly she was crying. great heaving sobs that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep inside. Mira wrapped her arms around her sister, and both girls clung to each other, while 15 years of isolation screamed at Clay to leave them alone, to give them space, to maintain the careful distance he'd built between himself and all human connection. But he didn't listen. Instead, he moved around the table and pulled both girls against his chest, one arm around each of them, and let them cry against his worn shirt while the morning sun climbed higher and the coffee grew cold and something frozen inside him began. Finally, to Thor, the first week passed in careful silence, each of them learning the boundaries of this new arrangement, like animals testing unfamiliar ground. Clay gave the girls his bed and took to sleeping on the floor near the fireplace, his body protesting the hard planks, but his conscience easier for the sacrifice. Priya and Mira whispered to each other in Bengali when they thought he couldn't hear, their voices carrying the particular cadence of sisters who'd survived by clinging to each other when the world offered nothing else. Clay established routines because routines created structure, and structure was the only thing standing between survival and chaos in the high country. He woke before dawn, stoked the fire, started coffee, then went outside to check his traps and tend to his horse, a sturdy Morgan mare named Constance, who'd been his only companion for the better part of a decade. When he returned, the girls would be awake, sitting at the table with their hands folded, waiting for permission to exist in his space. "You don't need to wait for me," he told them on the third morning. "There's food in the stores, water in the bucket. You're not prisoners here." But Priya shook her head, her dark eyes serious beyond her years. "We wait because it is your home. We are guests. Guests do not take without asking." Clay wanted to argue, wanted to tell them this was their home now too, but the words stuck in his throat. He'd spent 15 years alone, had forgotten how to share space, how to make room for others in the carefully ordered world he'd built. So instead he just nodded and served them breakfast. Cornmeal mush sweetened with the last of his honey, and they ate in silence broken only by the crackle of the fire and the distant call of ravens. On the fourth day, he took them outside to show them the property. The cabin sat in a natural clearing, carved by an ancient rockslide, surrounded by towering pines and granite outcroppings that caught the morning sun and held it like cupped hands. Below them, the valley stretched green and gold, and above them the peaks rose white-capped and eternal. A spring-fed creek ran along the eastern edge of the clearing, its water cold and clear, tumbling down from snowmelt higher up. "This is good land," Priya said, studying the layout with the practical eye of someone who'd learned to assess survival prospects quickly. "Protected from wind, close to water, defensible." Clay glanced at her sharply. "You know something about defense." "Our father was a soldier," she replied, "before the sickness took him. He taught us to see terrain the way warriors see it, to understand where safety lives and where danger hides." "Smart man," Clay said, and meant it. He pointed to the tree line. "Bears sometimes come through in late summer, looking for berries. They won't bother you if you don't bother them, but make noise when you're moving through the woods so you don't surprise one. Mountain lions are rarer but more dangerous. They hunt at dawn and dusk, and they like to attack from behind, so never turn your back on the forest when you're alone." Mira's eyes went wide. "There are lions here?" "Cougars," Clay corrected. "Different from what you'd have in India, but just as deadly. The important thing is to make yourself big. If you see one, yell and wave your arms, don't run. Running triggers their hunting instinct." He continued the lesson, showing them which plants were safe to eat and which would make them sick, how to read the sky for incoming weather, how to follow game trails and identify scat. The girls listened with the intensity of students who understood their lives might depend on the information, asking sharp questions that suggested minds far more capable than their treatment in Redemption Springs had implied. By afternoon they were all exhausted, the altitude and the work taking its toll. Clay sent the girls inside to rest while he split wood for the winter stores. He was 3 logs in when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to find Priya watching, her expression determined. "Teach me," she said. Clay lowered the axe. "Teach you what?" "To split wood, to hunt, to survive. You said we could stay, but staying means being useful. We will not be burdens." There was steel in her voice, pride that had been battered but not broken. Clay recognized it, because he'd heard the same tone in his own voice 15 years ago when he told himself he didn't need anyone, that self-sufficiency was the only honor left to him. "You're 11 years old," he said carefully. "You're not a burden just because you're not chopping wood." "I am 11 years old, and I have kept my sister alive through a cholera epidemic, a sea voyage that killed half the children aboard, and a town that wanted us dead," Priya said flatly. "I am not asking for your pity. I'm asking for your knowledge." Clay studied her for a long moment, saw the same desperation in her eyes that he'd seen in young soldiers during the war. Boys, barely older than she was, who'd begged him to teach them how to survive the next battle. He'd turned some away, thinking he was protecting them, and he'd watched them die in the first engagement because they hadn't known how to load their rifles properly. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "All right," he said, and handed her the axe. "But we start with something lighter than this." Over the next days, he taught them the skills they'd need. Not just survival skills, but the practical knowledge of living in isolation. He showed Priya how to maintain the rifle, how to aim and fire and clean it afterward. He taught Mira, who had quicker hands, how to set snares for rabbits and read animal tracks. He drilled them both on the locations of emergency supplies, on what to do if he didn't return from a hunt, on how to signal for help and when to run. The girls absorbed everything with the hunger of students who understood education was survival. They practiced until their hands blistered, until Priya could load the rifle in under 30 seconds, and Mira could identify every edible plant within a mile of the cabin. They grew stronger, their bodies filling out with regular meals and hard work, their movements gaining the confidence of people who belonged somewhere. But Clay knew their peace was temporary. Redemption Springs lay just 2 miles down the mountain, close enough that he could see the smoke from their chimneys on clear days. The town hadn't forgotten about the girls, and men like the preacher didn't forgive perceived insults easily. He kept his rifle loaded at all times now, kept watch during the nights when the girls slept, listened for sounds that didn't belong. On the 10th day, his vigilance proved justified. He was checking his trapline in the early morning when Constance whinnied sharply from the lean-to, the sound carrying alarm. Clay dropped the rabbits he'd collected and ran back toward the cabin, his hand already on his pistol. He burst into the clearing and found Mira standing on the porch, her face pale, pointing toward the trail. 3 riders were approaching, moving slow and deliberate up the mountain path. Even from a distance, Clay recognized the lead horse, a big roan gelding that belonged to Samuel Gaines, the mayor of Redemption Springs. The other 2 riders were strangers, but their clothes marked them as town men, probably lawyers or officials from the territorial government. Clay's jaw tightened. This wasn't a mob with torches and rope. This was something more dangerous. This was the law. He strode to the cabin and found Priya already pulling Mira inside, her movements quick and practiced. She met Clay's eyes through the doorway, and he saw understanding there, the recognition that their fragile safety had just been challenged. "Stay inside," he ordered. "Don't come out unless I call for you." He positioned himself on the porch, rifle held across his chest, in a posture that wasn't quite threatening, but made his readiness clear. The riders approached within 20 yards and stopped. Gaines dismounting with the careful movements of a man who knew he was in range of a marksman. "Bridger," Gaines called out, his voice carrying the false friendliness of politicians. "Good to see you. Been a while since you came down to town. I come when I need supplies," Clay replied flatly. "Don't see any need today." Gaines smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Well, that's the thing. We need to talk about supplies, specifically about the 2 items you acquired last week without proper documentation." One of the other men dismounted, a thin fellow in a dust coat and spectacles who had the look of a territorial bureaucrat. He pulled papers from his saddlebag and unfolded them with theatrical precision. "Mr. Bridger, I'm Cornelius Webb, Territorial Assessor. I'm here regarding the 2 minor children currently residing on your property. According to missionary records and town testimony, these children were wards of the late Reverend Harper, and upon his death became the responsibility of Redemption Springs until proper placement could be arranged. They were being chased by a mob," Clay said, his voice hard as granite. "That's not placement. That's attempted murder." Webb's expression didn't change. "The town maintains the children present a public health hazard. Multiple deaths and misfortunes have been documented in their presence. While I understand your charitable impulse, the territorial government has a responsibility to protect the general welfare." "The territorial government has a responsibility to protect children from being murdered by superstitious cowards," Clay shot back. The third man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Marshal Davidson out of Denver. Mr. Webb requested federal assistance in this matter, given the, let's say, unusual circumstances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." He fixed Clay with a hard stare. "You're harboring 2 foreign nationals without proper guardianship documentation. That's a territorial offense. We're authorized to take them into custody, pending a hearing on their status." Clay's grip tightened on the rifle. "And where exactly would this custody be? Back in Redemption Springs where they were almost killed? Or some other town that's heard the stories and thinks they're cursed?" That's not your concern," Davidson said, his hand moving casually toward the pistol at his hip. "You're a civilian. These are government matters. Now you can hand over the girls peacefully, or we can come back with more men and take them by force. Your choice." Behind Clay, he heard the cabin door creak. He didn't turn around, didn't need to. He could feel Priya's presence like heat against his back. Her voice came clear and steady, speaking not to the men but to him. "Mr. Bridger, we will go if you tell us to. We will not bring you more trouble than we already have." Something in Clay's chest cracked wide open at those words, at the resignation in her tone, at the terrible understanding that they expected to be abandoned because everyone always abandoned them. He thought of the war, of the orders he'd followed that he knew were wrong, of the children he'd watched die because good men had stood by and let it happen. He'd spent 15 years in these mountains, running from those memories, trying to forget the weight of all the times he'd failed to act. But standing here with Priya and Mira at his back and 3 armed men demanding he surrender them to almost certain death, Clay realized he'd been preparing for this moment all along. Every trap he'd set, every shot he'd practiced, every day he'd survived alone had been leading here. To this choice, to this line he would not cross. "Marshal," Clay said, his voice carrying across the clearing with absolute finality, "you're going to get back on that horse. You're going to ride down this mountain, and you're going to tell whoever sent you that these girls are under my protection, and that protection extends to the grave. Mine or yours? Your choice." Davidson's eyes narrowed. "You're threatening a federal marshal." "I'm making a promise," Clay said. "You come for these girls, you better come ready to kill me, because that's the only way you're taking them. And before you calculate those odds, you should know I survived 3 years of war by being meaner and more stubborn than the men trying to kill me. I'm older now, but I'm not softer. So ask yourself, Marshal, is enforcing the prejudices of a frightened town worth dying for?" The clearing went silent, except for the wind moving through the pines and the nervous stamping of horses. Gaines looked between Clay and the marshal, his political instincts clearly screaming at him to de-escalate. Webb adjusted his spectacles nervously. Only Davidson seemed unmoved, his hand still resting on his pistol. Then Priya stepped fully onto the porch, Mira beside her. Both girls stood straight, their faces composed despite the fear Clay could sense radiating from them. Priya spoke, her accented English carrying dignity that shamed the men before her. "We are Priya and Mira Sharma, daughters of Rajesh Sharma, who served with honor in the British Indian Army. We have survived cholera and starvation and hatred in 3 countries. We have been called plague and curse and demon, but we are none of those things. We are only children who want to live." She paused, then added with devastating simplicity, "If you take us from this place, we will die. If you leave us here, we will become strong. The choice is yours, but know that whatever you choose, we will face it with more courage than you have shown us." The words hung in the mountain air, an indictment more powerful than any threat Clay could have made. He saw Webb look away, saw shame flicker across Gaines's face. Even Davidson's expression shifted, something human showing through the official mask. "This isn't over," the marshal finally said, but his hand moved away from his pistol. "We'll be filing a report. There will be a formal inquiry." "You do that," Clay said. "And while you're filing reports, these girls will be learning to read and write and survive. So when your inquiry finally crawls up this mountain, you'll find 2 educated, healthy children instead of 2 corpses. Then you can explain to your superiors why you thought the second option was preferable." Gaines cleared his throat. "Bridger, if you're taking responsibility for them, there are proper procedures. Guardianship papers, territorial approval, verification of adequate provisions." "Then send the papers," Clay said. "I'll sign whatever needs signing. But the girls stay here while we sort the bureaucracy." The 3 men exchanged glances, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Davidson nodded curtly, remounted his horse, and the 3 of them turned back down the trail without another word. Clay watched until they disappeared into the trees, his body rigid with tension that wouldn't release until he was certain they were truly gone. When he finally lowered the rifle, his hands were shaking. Priya and Mira stood frozen beside him, as if movement might shatter whatever spell had just protected them. Then Mira made a small sound, half sob and half laugh, and suddenly both girls were pressed against Clay's sides, their arms wrapped around him, their faces buried in his shirt. Clay stood motionless, his arms hanging useless at his sides, 15 years of isolation screaming at him not to respond, not to allow this connection. But then he felt Priya trembling, felt Mira's tears soaking through the fabric, felt the desperate relief radiating from both of them, and slowly, carefully he raised his arms and pulled them close. "You're staying," he said, his voice rough with emotions he'd thought long dead. "I don't care what papers they want or what inquiries they run. You're staying, and anyone who tries to change that will have to go through me." Priya pulled back enough to look up at him, her eyes swimming with tears. "Why? Why would you risk everything for us?" Clay thought about all the reasons he could give, all the logical arguments and moral justifications. But in the end, the truth was simpler and more profound than any of that. He looked at these 2 girls who'd survived more than most men, twice their age, who'd been called plague when they were blessing, who'd been condemned when they deserved protection. And he knew with absolute certainty that this moment was what all his surviving had been for. "Because you called me Mr. Bridger," he said finally. "Because you waited at the table for permission. Because you asked to learn instead of taking. Because you're brave and strong and stubborn enough to survive what would have broken most people. Because when I look at you, I don't see plague. I see the family I thought I'd lost forever." The words surprised him as much as them, but once spoken, he knew they were true. These girls had become his purpose, his redemption, his reason to be something more than a ghost haunting the high country. They'd given him back his humanity without even trying, simply by needing him and by teaching him that needing wasn't weakness. Mira's voice was muffled against his chest. "Does this mean we can call you something other than Mr. Bridger?" Clay felt something that might have been a laugh working its way up from his chest, rusty from disuse, but real. "What did you have in mind?" The sisters exchanged glances, that silent communication that came from shared survival. Then Priya spoke, testing the word carefully, as if afraid it might shatter. "Papa?" And Clay Bridger, who'd spent 15 years convinced he'd never be anyone's father again, found himself nodding through the unexpected sting of tears. "Yeah," he managed. "Yeah, that works just fine. Winter came early to the high country that year, snow falling in thick curtains before October had fully passed, and Clay found himself grateful for the isolation the weather brought. The territorial inquiry continued somewhere down in the valleys, papers shuffling between bureaucrats who'd never climbed above 6,000 feet. But the snow made the mountain impassable and bought them time. Time for the girls to grow stronger, time for Clay to figure out what it meant to be responsible for two lives that weren't his own. The cabin shrank with 3 people living in it. The space that had seemed adequate for one feeling cramped and close with bodies and belongings competing for room. Clay built a partition wall using planks he'd been saving for other projects, creating a small, separate area for the girls that gave them privacy, and him back his corner near the fireplace. Priya and Meera decorated their space with things they found on walks, pine cones and interesting stones and bird feathers, small claims of ownership that transformed raw wood into home. But the physical arrangements were the easy part. The harder challenge was figuring out how to raise children when Clay's only experience with family had ended 15 years ago in blood and grief. He had no template for this, no guidebook for turning 2 traumatized orphans into functional human beings while simultaneously remembering how to be human himself. He started with education because education was something concrete, something he could measure and control. The girls could read and write already. Harper had taught them that much. But their English was heavily accented, and their knowledge of American history and customs was limited to what they'd absorbed through observation and survival. Clay pulled out his small library, books he'd carried through the war and into exile, volumes on history and science and literature that he'd read 100 times in the long mountain winters. "Can you read this?" he asked Priya one morning, handing her a worn copy of Thoreau's Walden. She studied the first page, her lips moving silently as she worked through the unfamiliar words. "I can read the letters, but the meaning is difficult. Too many words I don't know. Then we'll learn them," Clay said, and thus began their daily lessons. Every morning after breakfast, they gathered at the table and worked through vocabulary and grammar, Clay explaining American idioms that made no literal sense, Priya and Meera teaching him words in Bengali that had no English equivalent, all 3 of them discovering that language was a bridge that could be built from both sides. Meera proved to have a gift for mathematics, solving arithmetic problems in her head faster than Clay could work them on paper. "Our mother taught us," she explained when he remarked on her speed. "She said numbers were the same in every language, that they would serve us no matter where we went." "Smart woman," Clay said, and saw both girls' faces light up at the compliment to their mother, at the acknowledgement that they'd come from good people who'd loved them before the world had taken everything away. He taught them American geography using maps he'd drawn himself, showing them where Colorado sat in relation to the coasts, explaining the size of the country they now lived in. He told them about the war, not the glory version that newspapers printed, but the truth of it, the mud and blood and senseless waste, the way good men had killed each other over principles that seemed less clear with every year that passed. "Why did you fight?" Priya asked one day, her finger tracing the boundary between Union and Confederate territories on Clay's crude map. Clay considered lying, giving her some noble answer about freedom and unity, but he'd promised himself he wouldn't lie to them. "Because everyone I knew was fighting, and I thought not fighting made me a coward. Later I stayed because the men in my unit became my family, and you don't abandon family even when the cause turns rotten." "Did you kill people?" Meera's question was quiet, almost tentative, as if she feared the answer but needed to hear it anyway. "Yes," Clay said simply, "more than I can count. Some deserved it, some didn't. Most were just scared boys like me trying to survive until tomorrow." The girls absorbed this in silence, processing the idea that their protector had been a killer, that the man who called them blessed had blood on his hands, stretching back years. Finally Priya spoke, her voice thoughtful. "In India there is a saying, 'The sword that protects the village cannot remain clean.' Is this true in America too?" Clay felt something loosen in his chest, some knot of shame he'd carried since Appomattox. "Yeah," he said roughly. "That's true everywhere, I think." The lessons expanded beyond books as winter deepened. Clay taught them practical skills that would keep them alive if something happened to him, showing them how to butcher game and preserve meat, how to render fat for candles and soap, how to identify the signs of frostbite and hypothermia. He drilled them on what to do if the cabin caught fire, if they got lost in a whiteout, if they encountered hostile men or dangerous animals. "You think something bad will happen?" Priya observed one afternoon after a particularly intense session on winter survival. "You are preparing us for your absence." Clay paused in the middle of demonstrating how to start a fire with damp wood. The girl was too perceptive by half, saw through him like he was made of glass. "I'm preparing you for reality," he said. "I'm not a young man, and this is dangerous country. Best you know how to survive without me just in case." "We will not let you die," Mira announced, with the absolute conviction of a 9-year-old who hadn't yet learned that determination couldn't stop bullets or avalanches, or the simple wearing down of time. Clay smiled despite himself. "Appreciate the sentiment, little one, but death comes for everyone eventually. What matters is what you do with the time before." Christmas approached, though Clay had stopped marking the holiday years ago. But the girls asked about it, curious about American customs, and he found himself digging through his stored supplies for anything that might serve as celebration. He had no decorations, no special foods, no gifts wrapped in paper. But he managed to shoot a turkey and showed them how to roast it properly, made a crude approximation of pie using dried apples and precious sugar, told them stories about Christmases from his childhood, when his parents had still been alive and the world had seemed full of possibility. On Christmas morning, he woke to find that Priya and Mira had made him gifts. Priya had sewn a patch onto his worn coat, using scraps of fabric and thread she'd found in his supplies, creating an intricate pattern of mountains and stars that showed surprising artistic skill. Mira had carved him a new pipe from a piece of cherry wood, the bowl smooth and perfectly shaped, the stem decorated with careful designs. Clay held the gifts in his scarred hands and felt his throat close with emotion he had no words for. "You didn't have to do this," he managed. "Yes, we did," Priya said firmly. "You gave us life. This is very small payment." "You don't owe me payment," Clay said, but Priya shook her head. "Not payment, then. Gratitude, love, whatever word Americans use for the feeling that makes your chest hurt in a good way. Clay pulled them both into an embrace, his face pressed into their dark hair, and thought that maybe this was what redemption felt like. Not grand gestures or dramatic sacrifices, but small moments of connection that stitched torn souls back together, one thread at a time. The peaceful routine shattered on a grey January morning when Clay was checking his trapline and found something that made his blood run cold. Tracks in the snow, boot prints too large to be animal, too deliberate to be accident. Someone had been watching the cabin, circling it during the night, studying their movements and routines. The tracks led back down toward Redemption Springs, and Clay knew with sick certainty that their borrowed time had run out. He hurried back to the cabin and found the girls working on their lessons, Priya helping Mira with a difficult passage from one of his books. They looked up when he entered, and whatever they saw in his face made them both go still. "Pack your things," Clay said, his voice clipped and military. "Just what you can carry. We're leaving." "Leaving?" Priya's eyes widened. "Why? What happened?" "Someone was here last night, watching. That means they're planning something. And I'm not waiting around to find out what." He moved to his gun cabinet, began loading weapons and ammunition into a leather satchel. "There's an old mining camp about 6 miles north, abandoned but still standing. We'll go there until I can figure out what we're dealing with." "Whisty." Mira's voice was small, frightened. "Are they coming to take us away?" Clay stopped his frantic preparations and crossed to where both girls sat frozen at the table. He knelt so he could look them in the eyes, his hands resting on their shoulders. Listen to me. Nobody is taking you anywhere. But the men from town, they're not going to give up easy, and I'd rather move now while we have the advantage than wait for them to come in force. This is just precaution, not surrender. Understand?" And they nodded, but he could see the fear in their eyes, the terrible understanding that safety was always temporary, that the world kept trying to take from them no matter how far they ran. It made him angry, made him want to march down to Redemption Springs and put his rifle to the preacher's head and ask if his righteous crusade was worth dying for. But anger was a luxury they couldn't afford, so instead he helped them pack their few possessions, made sure they dressed in layers against the cold, loaded supplies onto Constance's back until the mare snorted in protest. Within an hour, they were ready. The cabin abandoned but not destroyed, left as a decoy while they disappeared into the high country. The trek north was brutal. Fresh snow made the going slow, and the altitude affected the girls who'd only had months to adjust to the thin mountain air. They stopped frequently, ostensibly to rest the horse, but really to let Priya and Mira catch their breath, their faces pale and lips tinged blue despite their heavy coats. Clay pushed them as gently as he could, knowing that speed might mean the difference between escape and capture. They reached the mining camp by mid-afternoon, a cluster of half-collapsed structures huddled in a narrow canyon where silver-hungry men had once dreamed of striking it rich. Most of the buildings were unsalvageable, roofs caved in and walls rotted, but one cabin at the far end remained mostly intact. Clay checked it carefully for structural soundness and animal inhabitants before allowing the girls inside. It was smaller than his cabin and in worse repair, but it had 4 walls and a roof and a fireplace that still drew. Clay got a fire started, while the girls huddled together for warmth, their eyes huge in the dim light, their earlier confidence shaken by this sudden flight. He wanted to comfort them but didn't know how, had no experience with soothing frightened children. So instead he did what he knew. He made the space secure, blocked the broken windows with spare canvas, reinforced the door with a plank, positioned his weapons within easy reach. He melted snow for water and heated it for tea, added the last of his honey to make it sweet and warming. He laid out their bedrolls near the fire and made sure the girls ate, even though none of them had much appetite. Night fell fast in the canyon, shadows pooling like ink between the ruined buildings. Clay sat by the window with his rifle, watching the trail they'd used, looking for signs of pursuit. Behind him he could hear Priya and Mira whispering to each other in Bengali, their voices carrying the particular tone of sisters, sharing fears they didn't want adults to hear. "You can speak English," Clay said without turning around. "I know you're scared. No point pretending otherwise." Silence, then Priya's voice, hesitant. "Will we always have to run? Will there never be a place where we can stay?" Clay considered lying, considered telling them everything would be fine, that this was temporary, and soon they'd return to the cabin and resume their peaceful life. But he'd promised not to lie, and children who'd survived what these two had survived deserved truth, even when truth was hard. "I don't know," he admitted. "There are men down in that town who've convinced themselves you're evil, and convincing them otherwise might be impossible. But here's what I do know. I'm not giving you up. Whatever it takes, whatever we have to do, you're mine now, and I protect what's mine. Even if that means we spend the rest of our lives moving from one camp to another, even if that means I have to put down every man who comes for you, I will do it." "That's not a life," Mira said softly. "That's just survival." Clay turned to look at them, these two girls who'd already learned the difference between living and merely not dying. "Sometimes survival is all we get," he said. "Sometimes we have to survive long enough for the world to change, for the men who hate us to die or forget, for new people to come who see us different. Your parents survived in India long enough to have you, to teach you and love you and give you the tools to keep surviving. Harper survived long enough to get you out of a country that was killing you. Now I'm going to survive long enough to see you grown and strong and free. That's not nothing. That's everything." Priya wiped at her eyes, her voice thick with tears. "We are tired of surviving. We want to live." "Then we'll figure out how to do both," Clay said. "But first, we have to get through tonight, and tomorrow, and however many days it takes for me to settle this thing with the town. Can you do that? Can you trust me to handle this?" Both girls nodded, and Clay turned back to the window, his jaw set with determination that felt like iron in his bones. He'd spent 15 years hiding from the world, running from responsibility and connection and the weight of caring about anything beyond his own survival. But these girls had changed him, had reminded him that some things were worth fighting for, worth dying for if it came to that. And if Redemption Springs wanted war, then war was what they'd get. Clay Bridger had survived worse than a mob of frightened miners. He'd survived the actual war, the one that had tried to grind America itself into dust. He'd survived loss and guilt and 15 years of isolation that would have broken lesser men. He could survive this too. But more importantly, he would make sure Priya and Mira survived it. Because they weren't plague, they were blessing, and he'd be damned if he let anyone convince them otherwise. The night passed without incident, though Clay didn't sleep. He watched the darkness and listened to the wind howling through the canyon and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. But he also thought about the carved pipe Mira had made him, about the patch Priya had sewn with such care, about the way they'd started calling him Papa, with the tentative hope of children testing whether love was real. By dawn, he'd made his decision. Running would only delay the inevitable. If he wanted to give these girls a real life, not just survival but actual living, he'd have to stop running and start fighting. Not with guns, necessarily, though he'd use those if he had to, but with whatever tools would work. Law, shame, reason, or if those failed, then yes, violence, because sometimes the sword that protects the village cannot remain clean. And Clay had long ago accepted that his sword would never be clean again. What mattered now was making sure it stayed sharp enough to protect the two people who'd given him back his reason to swing it. Clay left the girls in the mining camp with strict instructions and enough supplies to last 3 days, then rode Constance back down the mountain, alone in the grey pre-dawn light. He'd considered bringing Priya and Mira with him, keeping them close where he could protect them, but ultimately decided that keeping them hidden was safer than exposing them to whatever confrontation was brewing. Before leaving, he'd shown Priya where he kept his spare pistol and made her promise to shoot first and ask questions later if anyone but him approached the camp. The ride down took 2 hours through snow that had started falling again, thick flakes that would cover his tracks within the hour. Clay had chosen his route carefully, approaching Redemption Springs from the east rather than the direct northern path, wanting to scout the town's disposition before making his presence known. He tethered Constance in a stand of aspens a half-mile out and continued on foot, his Winchester slung across his back and his Colt revolver loose in its holster. Redemption Springs looked smaller in daylight than it had in his memories. Just 24 buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained. The mine entrances dotted the hillside above town like wounds in the earth, most of them already abandoned as the silver played out and the miners moved on to chase new rumors of wealth. Clay estimated maybe 60 people still lived here, down from twice that number a year ago, all of them clinging to the hope that one more strike would save them from admitting their town was dying. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. He watched from the tree line as the town woke, smoke rising from chimneys, men emerging to trudge toward the few mines still operating. The saloon was already open despite the early hour, and through its grimy windows, Clay could see a cluster of men gathered around something on the bar. He needed to get closer, needed to understand what he was walking into before he made his move. Clay circled to the back of the general store, a building he knew had a rear entrance that the storekeeper kept unlocked for deliveries. He slipped inside, moving quiet through the storage room, and positioned himself near the doorway where he could hear the conversation happening out front. The storekeeper, a man named Hutchins, who'd always been fair in his dealings, was talking to someone in the low tones people used when discussing trouble. "I'm telling you, Gaines, this has gone too far. Tracking them to the high country, planning to burn them out, it's not right. They're children, for God's sake." Mayor Gaines's voice carried the defensiveness of a weak man trying to sound strong. "It's not about right or wrong, it's about protecting the town. The preacher says those girls are cursed, and look at what's happened since Bridger took them in. Thompson's wife died in childbirth last week. The north shaft collapsed and killed 2 men. The creek's still running foul. How much more proof do you need?" "The proof of what?" Hutchins shot back. "That winter's hard in the mountains. That mining is dangerous. That women die in childbirth because we don't have a proper doctor. You're seeing patterns where there's only bad luck, and you're letting fear turn you into something ugly." A third voice joined in, one Clay didn't recognize. The territorial assessor sent word that Bridger's claim to guardianship has no legal standing. Said we're within our rights to retrieve the children by any means necessary, given the public health concerns. Clay's jaw tightened. So they had their official permission, their bureaucratic blessing to do violence wrapped in legal language. It was the oldest trick in the book, making cruelty seem legitimate by putting it on paper. "When?" Hutchins asked, and Clay could hear the defeat in his voice, the sound of a good man giving up because fighting seemed too costly. "Tomorrow night," Gaines replied. "Coltrane's tracking them now. He'll find where they're hiding, and we'll go in with enough men to make sure Bridger can't stop us. The preacher wants them driven clear out of the territory, but honestly, I don't care if they freeze to death up there. Just so long as they're gone and this curse lifts." Clay had heard enough. He slipped back through the storage room and out into the cold morning, his mind already calculating odds and options. They'd be coming tomorrow night, which gave him less than 36 hours to prepare. He could run further north with the girls, try to stay ahead of the pursuit, but winter was deepening, and eventually they'd run out of mountain. He could try to fight them off when they came, but he was one man against however many Coltrane brought with him. And even if he won that fight, more would follow. No, running and fighting weren't the answers. What he needed was to change the equation entirely, to take away their justification and their will to pursue. He needed to prove the girls weren't cursed, which meant proving the town's misfortunes had nothing to do with Priya and Mira. An idea formed, dangerous and desperate, but possibly workable. Clay made his way back to where he'd left Constance, but instead of returning to the mining camp, he rode hard toward the east, toward the territorial capital where he knew a man who might be able to help. Captain Ezra Morrison had served under Clay during the war, had been a green lieutenant who'd matured into a competent officer through the crucible of combat. After Appomattox, Morrison had gone into territorial law enforcement and now worked as chief investigator for the Territorial Health Department. Clay had kept loose track of his former subordinate over the years, through the occasional letter. New Morrison was based in Central City, a day's hard ride from Redemption Springs. Clay pushed Constance harder than he should have, the mare laboring through deep snow and steep terrain. But he reached Central City by late afternoon. He found Morrison in a small office above the assayer's building, surrounded by papers and looking 10 years older than when Clay had last seen him 5 years prior. Bridger. Morrison stood, shock and pleasure warring on his weathered face. "Christ, I thought you were dead. Haven't heard from you since that letter about settling in the high country. Need your help, Ezra." Clay didn't waste time on pleasantries. "There's a situation in Redemption Springs involving 2 orphaned girls. Superstition and mob justice about to turn deadly. Morrison listened as Clay laid out the story, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Clay finished, Morrison sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. Cholera stillbirths mining accidents. They're blaming foreign children for natural causes and bad safety practices. I've seen it before, though usually it's Chinese workers or Irish immigrants getting scapegoated. Can you do something about it? Clay asked. Official investigation, health inspection, something that proves these girls aren't the source of the town's problems. Morrison considered, then nodded slowly. The territorial government has been concerned about mining safety violations in that area. Multiple complaints about owners cutting corners, not maintaining proper ventilation or structural supports. I could authorize an immediate inspection, close down unsafe operations, and conduct health surveys to identify actual disease vectors. He met Clay's eyes. But that will take time to organize, and it sounds like you don't have much time. Less than a day before they come for the girls, Clay confirmed. Then we ride tonight. Morrison stood, began gathering papers and stuffing them into a leather case. I'll bring my authority and documentation. You bring your knowledge of the terrain and your very intimidating presence. Together, maybe we can convince Redemption Springs that their problems are human-made, not curse-made. They rode out within the hour, Morrison bringing 2 deputies as escort and witness. The group made camp halfway back to Redemption Springs, too dark and dangerous to continue through mountain passes at night. Clay barely slept, his mind churning through scenarios and contingencies, calculating what would happen if Morrison's official authority wasn't enough to sway the town. By dawn, they were moving again, reaching the mining camp where Clay had left the girls by mid-morning. Priya and Mira emerged from the cabin with Clay's pistol held steady in Priya's small hands, only lowering it when they recognized him. Clay saw the fear and relief war across their faces as he dismounted. "Papa!" Mira ran to him, threw her arms around his waist. "You came back. Told you I would." Clay rested his hand on her head, then looked at Priya, who stood in the doorway with the gun still in her grip. "You did good keeping watch. But we're not staying here. We're going back down to town." Priya's eyes widened. "Back to Redemption Springs? They want to kill us there. They want to drive you out because they're scared." Clay gestured to Morrison and his deputies. "But Captain Morrison here is a territorial health investigator, and he's going to show them what they're really afraid of, isn't you? It's their own failures and bad luck. We're going to face this head-on instead of running, and if they don't listen?" Priya's voice was steady, but her hand trembled slightly on the pistol. "Then we'll have official documentation that they're violating territorial law, and Morrison can bring in federal marshals to enforce order." Clay knelt, so he was eye-level with both girls. "I know you're scared. I know every instinct says to run and hide, but sometimes you have to stand and fight for the right to exist in peace. Your father understood that, your mother too. Now it's our turn." The ride into Redemption Springs took 3 hours, Clay and the girls in front, with Morrison and his deputies following in official formation. They entered town at noon, when most of the miners were still underground, and the streets were relatively empty. Clay led them directly to the mayor's office, a small building that also served as the town hall and occasional courthouse. Gaines was there, along with the preacher and Coltrane, huddled over maps that Clay recognized as tracking charts showing the terrain north of town. They looked up as Clay pushed through the door, shock and anger flashing across their faces in equal measure. "Bridger," Gaines started, rising from his chair, "you have no business here. We have legal authority to what?" Morrison stepped forward, his territorial badge gleaming on his chest. "To harass children based on superstition? To conduct vigilante justice without proper investigation? I'm Captain Ezra Morrison, Territorial Health and Safety Department, and I'm here to conduct an official inquiry into conditions in Redemption Springs." The preacher's face went red. "This is town business, not territorial business." It became territorial business when you started blaming public health crises on foreign nationals without evidence. Morrison pulled papers from his case, slapped them on the desk. I have authority to inspect all mining operations, conduct health surveys, and investigate any claims of disease vectors or public safety threats. And based on preliminary review, I find significant violations of territorial safety codes. Evidence of contaminated water sources from improper mine tailings disposal, and zero evidence that these two children have contributed to your misfortunes in any measurable way. Coltrane stepped forward, his hand moving toward his gun. You can't just come in here and... I can, and I am. Morrison's deputies moved to flank him, their own weapons visible. Any interference with a territorial investigation is a federal offense. So unless you want to add obstruction charges to the safety violations I'm already documenting, I suggest you sit down and cooperate. The standoff lasted long seconds, tension thick enough to choke on. Clay kept himself positioned between the girls and the town men, his hand resting casually on his Colt, making it clear that Morrison's authority was backed by more than just words. Finally Gaines sat, defeat written across his face. What do you want? Full access to mine records, water testing results if you have any, documentation of all deaths and illnesses over the past 6 months, and cooperation with my investigation. Morrison's voice was crisp, official, the voice of someone who'd learned to wield bureaucracy like a weapon. I'll also be interviewing residents about working conditions and safety practices. Captain Bridger and his wards will be staying at the hotel under territorial protection while I conduct this investigation. Any attempts to interfere with them or continue this harassment will result in federal charges. Are we clear? The preacher stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You cannot protect evil. God's judgment is not yours to dispense. Morrison cut him off coldly. And frankly, Reverend, if your God is so concerned about these children, perhaps he should have prevented the cholera that killed their parents, or the fever that killed Harper, or any of the dozen other random misfortunes you're trying to pin on them. But since divine intervention seems lacking, we're going to rely on human investigation and evidence instead. The preacher stalked out, slamming the door behind him. Coltrane followed after a moment, muttering curses under his breath. Only Gaines remained, looking small and defeated behind his desk. They'll never accept this, the mayor said quietly. You can investigate all you want, prove the mines are unsafe and the water's bad, but the people believe what they believe. They've decided those girls are cursed, and no amount of evidence will change that. Then the people are wrong, Clay said flatly. And they'll learn to live with being wrong, or they'll answer to federal law. Either way, these girls are staying under my protection, and your mob is done hunting them. Morrison spent the rest of the day conducting his investigation, and what he found was damning. The mines had multiple safety violations, support beams rotted through, ventilation systems inadequate, no proper safety equipment. The town's water supply was contaminated with mercury and arsenic from mine tailings that had been dumped directly into the creek. 3 of the recent deaths Morrison attributed directly to heavy metal poisoning, 2 to mining accidents that were predictable given the conditions, 1 to complications from untreated infection that any competent doctor could have prevented. Your town is dying, Morrison told Gaines that evening, his report spread across the desk. But it's dying from greed and negligence, not from cursed children. The mine owners cut corners to maximize profit. The town built too close to contaminated water. You have no medical facilities adequate for your population. These are human failures, not divine judgment. But even as Morrison documented the truth, Clay could feel the town's hostility growing. Men gathered in the saloon, their voices carrying through the thin walls. The preacher held an evening service that was really a rally, calling down fire and brimstone, promising that territorial authority couldn't override God's will. Clay watched from the hotel window, Priya and Mira behind him, and knew that facts and evidence might not be enough. They still hate us, Priya said softly, standing beside him at the window. The captain proved we did nothing wrong, but they still want us gone. Clay didn't have a comforting lie to offer. She was right. Morrison's investigation had removed the legal justification for the town's persecution, but it hadn't removed the hate itself. Hate didn't need justification, didn't care about evidence or truth. It just needed a target. So what do we do? Mira asked from the bed where she sat wrapped in a blanket, her eyes huge in her small face. Clay turned from the window and looked at both girls. These two survivors who'd endured more than most people faced in a lifetime, who'd been called plague when they were blessing, who deserved peace and safety and couldn't seem to find it anywhere. He thought about running again, about taking them deeper into the mountains or heading to some other territory where their story hadn't preceded them. He thought about fighting, about making Redemption Springs pay for its cruelty, until the town learned fear of him exceeded their fear of the girls. But both options led only to more running, more fighting, an endless cycle that would consume all their lives. There had to be another way, something he wasn't seeing, some solution that didn't involve either fleeing or violence. The answer came from an unexpected source. There was a knock at the hotel room door, and when Clay answered with his hand on his gun, he found Hutchins, the storekeeper, standing in the hall, looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Bridger, I need to speak with you. With all of you." Hutchins glanced past him to where the girls sat. "I think I know a way to end this that doesn't involve anyone else dying." Clay let Hutchins into the room, but kept himself positioned between the storekeeper and the girls, his instincts still wary despite the man's seemingly peaceful intentions. Morrison had returned to his own room down the hall, exhausted from a day of documentation and confrontation, but Clay could summon him quickly if needed. Priya and Mira watched Hutchins with the guarded expressions of children who'd learned that adult intentions were rarely as benevolent as they seemed. Hutchins removed his hat and twisted it nervously in his hands, his eyes moving between Clay and the girls before settling somewhere around the middle distance. "I've been in Redemption Springs for 8 years, he began, his voice low and careful. "Came here thinking I'd make my fortune supplying miners. Ended up just watching good people turn bitter as the silver ran out and their dreams died. I've seen this town do ugly things before, drive out families who couldn't pay their debts, turn blind eyes when mine owners worked men to death. But this business with your girls, this is different. This is evil dressed up as righteousness, and I can't stand by anymore. So don't stand by," Clay said flatly. "Stand up, speak out. Tell the preacher and his mob that they're wrong." "I have been telling them," Hutchins replied with frustration bleeding through his careful tone. "So has Doc Wilson and Martha Henderson and a few others who can see past their fear. But we're outnumbered by people who need someone to blame for why their lives turned out hard and disappointing. Morrison's investigation proved the girls aren't causing the town's problems. But proof doesn't change belief when belief is all people have left to hold on to." Priya spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "Then what is your solution, Mr. Hutchins? If they will not listen to reason, if they will not accept evidence, what remains?" Hutchins finally met her eyes, and Clay saw genuine regret there, the look of a man about to propose something he knew was unfair but saw no alternative to. "You leave. Not driven out, not chased away, but you choose to go somewhere else. Somewhere bigger, where 2 Indian girls won't stand out so much, where people are used to foreigners and won't see you as threats. Denver maybe, or even California, where they've got whole communities of people from all over the world." Clay felt anger rise hot in his chest. "So your solution is surrender? Let the mob win by giving them exactly what they want?" "Oh, my solution is survival," Hutchins shot back, some steel entering his voice. "You think I like this? You think I want to tell 2 orphaned children to leave the only home they've found? But I'm trying to keep all of you alive, Bridger. The preacher is talking about divine judgment that needs to be carried out. Coltrane is gathering men who are more scared of damnation than they are of territorial law. Morrison can document violations all he wants, but he can't station deputies here permanently, and the minute he leaves, this town will come for those girls with everything they have." "Let them come," Clay said, his hand moving unconsciously to his gun. "I've faced worse than a mob of frightened miners." And you'll kill how many before they kill you? Hutchins demanded. 5, 10. Then what happens to Priya and Mira when you're dead? You think Morrison can protect them from hundreds of miles away? You think the territorial government cares enough about 2 foreign orphans to send troops? You're one man, Bridger, and you can't shoot your way to peace. The words hit hard because they were true. Clay had been calculating the same odds, had known that violence would only delay the inevitable. But hearing someone else say it out loud, hearing the logic laid bare, made the reality inescapable. Mira's voice was small, but clear in the tense silence. Where would we go? If we left, where would be safe? Hutchins turned to her, his expression softening. I have a sister in Denver. She runs a boarding house near the railway district, takes in all kinds of people, immigrants and travelers and folks starting over. She's good people, open-minded, and she owes me a favor. I could write to her, arrange for you to stay there until you get settled. Denver's big enough that 2 Indian girls won't cause talk, diverse enough that you could find community. Community, Priya repeated, testing the word. We have not had community since our parents died. Only people who tolerated us until we became inconvenient. My sister's not like that, Hutchins insisted. And Denver's not like Redemption Springs. It's a real city with laws that matter, and enough people that no single preacher can whip everyone into a mob. You'd have chances there, opportunities. You could go to proper school, learn trades, build real lives instead of hiding in the mountains. Clay wanted to argue, wanted to find holes in Hutchins' logic, but the worst part was that the man was making sense. Denver would offer the girls opportunities that hiding in the high country never could. Education, safety in numbers, the chance to grow up as something other than fugitives. But it would also mean separation, mean sending them away from the only person who'd called them blessed instead of cursed. And what about Papa? Mira asked, the words striking Clay's heart like a hammer. We cannot leave him. He is our family now. Hutchins looked between Clay and the girls, understanding dawning on his weathered face. You could go with them, he said to Clay. Nothing keeping you in these mountains except habit. You could start over in Denver too, be their guardian proper and legal. Give them stability instead of this constant running. Clay felt the walls of the hotel room pressing in. Felt 15 years of isolation, warring with 2 months of connection. Denver meant civilization, meant crowds and noise and all the things he'd fled after the war. It meant giving up the high country that had been his sanctuary, trading peace for chaos. But it also meant keeping the girls safe, giving them the future they deserved. I need to think, Clay said roughly. Give us the night. We'll have an answer by morning. Hutchins nodded and moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, Bridger, what you've done for these girls, taking them in when everyone else wanted them dead, that's the most decent thing I've seen in this town in 8 years. Whatever you decide, I'll help however I can. After Hutchins left, the 3 of them sat in heavy silence. The hotel room felt smaller than the cabin had ever felt, the walls thin enough that they could hear voices from other rooms, the sounds of a town that wanted them gone. Clay stared at the floor, his mind spinning through scenarios, calculating what safety looked like and what price it demanded. You want to go to Denver, Priya said. It wasn't a question. Clay looked up at her, at both of them, and saw his own conflict reflected in their eyes. I want you to be safe. I want you to have real lives, not just survival. If Denver offers that, then yes. Part of me wants you to go. But the other part? Mira pressed. The other part is selfish, Clay admitted. The other part doesn't want to give up the only family I've had in 15 years. Doesn't want to trade my mountain for city streets. Doesn't want to admit that maybe the best thing I can do for you is let you go somewhere I can't follow. Cannot or will not. Priya's voice was sharp, almost accusing. Mr. Hutchins said you could come with us. Are you saying you would choose mountains over us? The question hung between them like an accusation and a plea. Clay thought about the cabin he'd built with his own hands, the traplines he knew by heart, the peaks that had sheltered him when human company had become unbearable. He thought about the graves he'd left behind 15 years ago, the family he'd lost and never properly mourned because the war had demanded he keep fighting. The mountains had given him space to grieve, to heal in his broken way, to exist without demands or expectations. But they'd also given him loneliness disguised as peace. They'd let him hide from connection under the excuse of self-sufficiency. And then Priya and Mira had arrived and shown him that healing alone was just another form of dying. "I'm saying I'm scared," Clay said, the admission costing him more than any confession he'd made in years. "I'm scared that Denver will break me the way the war almost did. I'm scared that in all those people and noise and civilization, I'll lose whatever piece of myself I managed to save by coming here. But I'm more scared of losing you two, of sending you off alone and spending the rest of my life wondering if you're safe, if you're happy, if you remember the man who called you blessed." Tears streamed down Mira's face. "Then come with us." "Please, Papa. We will help you be brave in the city if you help us be brave leaving the mountain." Clay felt something break open in his chest, some final wall crumbling under the weight of their need and his own. He'd spent 15 years building those walls, convincing himself that isolation was strength, that needing nothing from no one made him invulnerable. But these girls had shown him that real strength was allowing yourself to be needed, that real courage was choosing connection even when it terrified you. "All right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "All right. We'll go to Denver together. We'll start over, all three of us. And we'll figure out how to live instead of just survive." Both girls launched themselves at him, their arms wrapping around him from both sides, their faces pressed into his chest. Clay held them tight, let them cry out their relief and fear and hope, while his own eyes burned with tears he hadn't shed since Appomattox. Outside the hotel window, Redemption Springs went about its evening business, unaware that the problem they'd wanted gone had just decided to leave on its own terms. They spent the evening planning. Clay would sell what supplies he couldn't carry, arrange for Morrison to file the official guardianship papers that would make his protection of the girls legal and binding. Hutchins would write to his sister, arrange accommodation and introduction. They'd leave within the week, before the weather turned worse, before the town could organize another attempt to drive them out violently. But first, Clay had one more thing to do. After the girls had finally fallen asleep in the hotel bed, exhausted from emotion and the weight of impending change, he slipped out into the night. The streets were mostly empty, just a few drunks stumbling between the saloon and their homes. Clay moved quietly to the church, a small building at the edge of town that served as the preacher's headquarters and spiritual armory. The preacher was inside, visible through the window, on his knees before the altar in what might have been prayer or might have been performance. Clay pushed open the door, the sound making the preacher turn with a start. "Bridger," the preacher stood, his face hardening. "Come to threaten me in God's house." "Oh, come to tell you that you won," Clay said, letting the door close behind him. "The girls and I are leaving, going to Denver, where people are too busy with their own problems to invent curses. You can tell your congregation that their prayers were answered, that the plague has been lifted." The preacher's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "This is a trick." "No trick, just exhaustion. I'm tired of fighting people who'd rather believe in curses than admit their own failures. Morrison proved those girls did nothing wrong, but proof doesn't matter to men like you. You need villains to explain why your righteous town is dying, why God isn't rewarding your faith with prosperity. So fine. We'll be your villains, but we'll be your villains somewhere else." The preacher opened his mouth to respond, probably with some biblical justification for his cruelty. But Clay held up his hand. "I don't want to hear it. I just came to tell you that you're going to have to find a new scapegoat when things keep going wrong after we leave. Because they will keep going wrong. The mines will keep failing, people will keep dying, your town will keep shrinking. And when it does, I hope you remember that you drove away 2 innocent children who needed help. and that your God, if he exists, is watching you and judging whether you deserve the faith you claim. See. Clay turned and walked out before the preacher could reply, leaving the man standing alone in his empty church. It wasn't the confrontation he'd imagined having, no violence or dramatic victory, just the hollow satisfaction of speaking truth that wouldn't be heard. But as he walked back through the cold night air toward the hotel where his daughters slept, Clay realized he didn't need the preacher's understanding or repentance. He just needed to keep Priya and Meera safe, and if that meant walking away from a fight he could never truly win, then walking away was what he'd do. Because being their father meant making hard choices, meant swallowing pride and accepting limitations, meant admitting that sometimes the bravest thing wasn't standing and fighting, but knowing when to move towards something better. When he returned to the hotel room, he found Priya awake, sitting by the window and watching the dark street below. She looked up as he entered, her expression knowing, "You went to see the preacher. How did you know?" "Because you needed to say goodbye to your anger," Priya said with wisdom beyond her 11 years. "Our father did the same before we left India. He went to the British officer who had refused to help us during the cholera, and he did not fight or curse. He just looked the man in the eyes and walked away. He said sometimes the best revenge is surviving when people want you dead." Clay sat beside her, their shoulders touching in the dark room. "Your father was a smart man. He would have liked you, I think. You are both men who protect even when protecting costs everything." They sat in companionable silence, father and daughter in all the ways that mattered, watching Redemption Springs sleep. Tomorrow they would begin the process of leaving, of packing up the fragile life they'd built and carrying it somewhere new. It would be hard, would demand courage from all of them, would require faith that better things waited beyond these mountains. But they would do it together. And that, Clay thought, made all the difference. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparation and goodbyes that weren't really goodbyes, because most of Redemption Springs was relieved to see them go. Clay sold his trapping equipment to Hutchins at a fair price, kept only what they could carry on the journey. Morrison expedited the guardianship papers through territorial channels, calling in favors and cutting through bureaucracy with the efficiency of a man who understood that justice delayed was justice denied. By the time the papers arrived with official seals and signatures, Clay Bridger was legally responsible for Priya and Meera Sharma, their protector recognized by law instead of just by choice. The cabin in the high country remained untouched, Clay's personal belongings still scattered across the single room, his books on the shelves, his traps hanging in the lean-to. He'd considered going back one final time to collect things or say some kind of farewell to the place that had sheltered him for 15 years, but ultimately decided against it. The cabin was part of a life he was choosing to leave behind, and returning would only make the leaving harder. Let it stand empty, let the mountain reclaim it slowly through seasons of snow and wind. They left Redemption Springs on a grey morning with snow threatening in the heavy clouds. Hutchins provided a wagon and 2 sturdy horses, refused payment beyond what Clay had already given him, pressed letters of introduction into their hands along with supplies for the 3-day journey to Denver. Doc Wilson came to see them off, as did Martha Henderson, whose stillborn child had been blamed on the girl's supposed curse, and a handful of others who'd never bought into the preacher's poison. "You're good people," Doc Wilson said, shaking Clay's hand with genuine warmth. "This town doesn't deserve you, but Denver will. You take care of those girls, and they'll take care of you right back." The preacher did not come, nor did Mayor Gaines or Coltrane or any of the men who'd wanted them dead. They watched from windows and doorways as the wagon rolled past, their faces expressions of relief and residual suspicion, still half convinced that plague was departing with the foreigners. Clay met their stares without flinching, let them see that he was leaving by choice, not by defeat, that their small hatreds had failed to break what he'd built with Priya and Meera. The first day's travel took them down out of the high country, through passes already thick with snow. Priya and Meera rode in the wagon bed, bundled in blankets and furs, their faces turned back toward the mountains that had briefly been home. Clay caught Meera crying silently once, tears freezing on her cheeks in the cold air. But when he asked if she wanted to stop, she shook her head. "I cry because it is beautiful, and we are leaving it," she explained. "But I do not want to stay. Beautiful things can still hurt you." They made camp that night in a stand of pines, where Clay built a fire and cooked salt pork and beans, food that tasted like every trail meal he'd eaten during the war, but somehow better, because he was sharing it with daughters instead of soldiers. After they'd eaten, Priya asked him to tell them about Denver, about what to expect, and Clay realized he had no good answers. He'd passed through the city twice, both times more than a decade ago, remembered it as loud and crowded and overwhelming after months of mountain silence. "It'll be different from anything you've known," he said honestly. "More people than you can count, buildings taller than trees, noise all hours. It'll be hard at first adjusting, but it'll also have opportunities. Real schools where you can learn more than I can teach you. Other children to befriend. Shops and libraries and all the things that come with civilization. Will people hate us there too?" Meera asked, her voice small in the firelight. Clay considered lying, considered promising her that Denver would be different, that prejudice somehow stopped at city limits. But he'd promised to be honest, and honest meant acknowledging hard truths. "Some will," he admitted. "There are mean people everywhere, people who fear what's different. But in a big city, those people are just voices in a crowd instead of the whole crowd. You'll find others like you, other immigrants, other people trying to build new lives. You'll find your place. And you?" Priya looked at him across the fire. "Will you find your place too, Papa? Or will you spend your life missing these mountains?" Clay poked at the fire, watched sparks spiral up into the dark sky. The question cut deeper than she probably intended, struck at fears he'd been avoiding examining too closely. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I know I'd rather miss mountains while I'm with you than miss you while I'm in mountains. That's enough to start with." The second day brought them down into the foothills, where the snow thinned and the air grew easier to breathe. They passed other travelers now, freight wagons and stagecoaches, families heading toward Denver's promise or away from its disappointments. Most gave them curious looks, a weathered mountain man and 2 Indian girls in a wagon, but no one troubled them. They stopped at a way station for supplies and hot food, and the woman running it was kind, gave the girls extra biscuits, and asked no questions about their unusual family composition. That night they camped near a creek where the water ran clear and cold. Clay taught the girls how to pan for gold, not because they needed money, but because the skill was part of living in Colorado territory, something they should know even if they never used it. Meera found a tiny flake of gold in her pan and held it up to the fading light, her face glowing with accomplishment. "We are rich," she declared with such seriousness that both Clay and Priya laughed. "Rich enough," Clay agreed, thinking that richness had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with moments like this, with watching a child find joy in small discoveries. On the third day, they crested a rise and Denver spread below them, bigger than Clay remembered, sprawling across the plain with the mountains at its back, like a city trying to have civilization and wilderness both. Smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys. The railway station gleamed with steel tracks stretching east toward the rest of America. And even from a distance the noise was audible, a constant hum of human activity. Priya and Meera stared at the city with expressions mixing wonder and terror. They'd come from India, where cities were even larger, but that had been another lifetime. And the girls they'd been then had died along with their parents. "It's so big," Meera whispered. "We'll start small," Clay promised. "Find Hutchins' sister's boarding house, get settled, take time to adjust. We don't have to conquer the whole city at once." They found the boarding house in the railway district as Hutchins had described. A 3-story building that had seen better days but maintained a dignity in its worn facade. Mrs. Sarah Walsh answered Clay's knock. a round woman with shrewd eyes that softened when she saw Priya and Meera huddled behind him. "You'd be Bridger," she said. "My brother wrote. Said you were bringing 2 girls who needed safety, and I was to provide it or he'd never speak to me again." She smiled. "Come in, all of you. Let's get you warm and fed. Then we'll figure out the rest." The boarding house held a dozen residents, a mix of railroad workers, shopkeepers, a widow, and a young couple saving to buy land. They were curious about the new arrivals, but not hostile, asked polite questions over dinner, and accepted Clay's brief explanations without prying. An Irish family had the room next to theirs, and their daughter Katie was close to Priya's age, immediately fascinated by the Indian girls. That first night in Denver, Clay lay awake in the small room Mrs. Walsh had given him while the girls slept in the adjoining space. The city noise was constant, voices and wagon wheels and distant train whistles, creating a soundtrack that felt like assault after years of quiet. Through the thin wall, he could hear Priya and Meera whispering to each other, making plans for tomorrow, wondering what school would be like. The weeks that followed were harder than Clay had anticipated. Denver, overwhelmed with its crowds and noise and constant motion, made him jumpy and short-tempered in ways he hadn't been since the war. He found work as a freight guard, using his mountain skills and war experience to protect shipments between Denver and the mining camps. But the work felt hollow compared to living off the land. But he also had Priya and Meera thriving in ways they never could have in the mountains. They attended the territorial school, where teachers who'd seen immigrant children before didn't blink at their accents or their skin color. They made friends with other outsiders, children of Chinese railway workers and freed slaves and European immigrants. They came home each day, bursting with stories about lessons and games. Mrs. Walsh became a grandmother figure, teaching the girls to cook American food while they taught her Indian recipes. Katie from next door became Priya's closest friend, the two of them inseparable. 6 months after arriving in Denver, Clay made his decision final. He filed papers to purchase a small house on the edge of town, nothing fancy but theirs completely, a place where Priya and Meera could have their own rooms. It meant committing fully to city life, giving up any fantasy of returning to the mountains permanently. The day they moved into the house, Meera found Clay standing in the backyard, staring at the mountains visible in the distance. She slipped her hand into his. "Do you miss it very much?" she asked. "The quiet and the snow and the being alone?" Clay squeezed her hand gently. "Sometimes, but you know what I'd miss more? Watching you grow up. Missing mountains is just nostalgia. Missing you would be grief. I know the difference now. 5 years passed in the way time does when life is being lived instead of merely survived. Priya grew into a young woman of 16 with plans to educate other immigrant children. Meera, at 14, showed talent for mathematics that her teacher said was exceptional. Clay aged into his 50s, his hair fully grey now. But he was healthier than he'd been in the high country, surrounded by people who cared whether he lived or died. The house had become a gathering place for the outsiders and the different. Proof that different kinds of families could work if built on love instead of blood. On a spring morning with the mountains sharp against blue sky, Priya came to Clay's workshop with news that Katie's family was returning to Ireland and had invited her to go for the summer. Clay's first instinct was to say no, to keep her close where he could protect her. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "but not if it hurts you." "I'll always need you," he said honestly. "But needing you doesn't mean keeping you. You go to Europe with Katie. You see the world. That's what children are supposed to do, grow up and live big lives." That evening the three of them sat on the porch, watching the mountains turn purple in the fading light. Neighbors walked past and called greetings. Somewhere in Redemption Springs, people probably still told stories about cursed Indian girls and the mountain man who'd been fool enough to take them in. But here in Denver, the only story that mattered was the truth. 2 orphaned sisters and a broken soldier had found each other when the world said they were all worthless. They'd been called plague and curse and burden, and they'd survived anyway. "Papa," Meera said softly. Do you remember that first night in your cabin, when you told us we were priceless? I remember, Clay said. Did you know then that you'd keep us forever? I didn't know anything, he admitted. I just knew I couldn't walk away. And every day since, I've made the same choice. To stay, to fight, to love you both. That's what family is. Not the knowing, but the choosing. Every single day I choose you, and we choose you, Priya said, taking one of his hands while Mira took the other. They sat together as the stars emerged above Denver. 3 souls who'd been broken and were being mended. 3 lives that proved love was stronger than hate. That chosen family was as real as blood. That everyone called plague was actually blessing to those brave enough to see it. The mountain stood eternal in the distance. But here in this small house on the edge of the city, Clay Bridger had found something better than mountain peace. He'd found purpose and the fierce joy of watching 2 girls he'd saved save him right back, because everyone had called them plague. But Clay Bridger had called them blessing, and he'd been right all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.